Hollywood's golden age dazzled the world, but behind the cameras, power came with a price. For decades, some of the industry's most influential men expected more than talent from the women chasing stardom. Those who refused didn't just lose a role. They lost contracts, reputations, sometimes entire careers, erased quietly, and rewritten in whispers. Today, we uncover 11 extraordinary women who chose dignity over fame, and paid for it in ways history rarely tells. Some vanished from Hollywood entirely. And one story, near the end, will leave you speechless. Actor 1. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe. The name alone conjures glamour, that unmistakable smile, and an icon status that still endures today. But behind the golden curls and the spotlight, Marilyn understood Hollywood's darkest secret better than almost anyone, and she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. Long before she became the most photographed woman in the world, Marilyn was just another hopeful starlet, chasing small roles and bigger dreams. And like so many young women of her era, she quickly discovered that talent alone rarely opened doors in the studio system. Auditions often came with unspoken conditions. Meetings with powerful executives weren't always about scripts or screen tests. What made Marilyn different wasn't that she avoided this reality. It was that she refused to stay quiet about it. In later interviews, she spoke with startling honesty about how the industry operated behind closed doors, once famously comparing Hollywood to a place where a woman's worth was measured by how far she was willing to bend. She admitted that in her early years, she walked away from meetings and situations she knew were designed to exploit her, even when saying no meant losing opportunities other actresses were eager to accept. That kind of honesty was almost unheard of at the time. Most stars, terrified of being blacklisted or branded difficult, buried these experiences and smiled for the cameras instead. Marilyn didn't. She spoke to journalists about being pressured by unnamed executives, becoming one of the very few actresses of her generation willing to publicly acknowledge what so many were forced to endure in silence. Of course, this honesty came at a cost. Marilyn herself admitted that her refusal to simply play along slowed her early career, delaying roles that might otherwise have come faster and easier. She once confided to a friend that in Hollywood, if you didn't cooperate, there would always be another 25 girls lined up who would. And yet, she rose anyway. Against a system built to reward compliance and punish defiance, Marilyn Monroe became one of the biggest stars the world has ever seen. Not despite her refusal to be exploited, but in many ways because of the strength it revealed. Her willingness to name what others were too afraid to mention made her more than an icon of beauty. It made her, quietly and powerfully, one of Hollywood's earliest voices against a culture that too often treated women as disposable. Marilyn Monroe's story reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing a woman in Hollywood could do wasn't win an award or land a leading role. It was simply telling the truth. Actor 2. Judy Garland. Judy Garland. To the world, she was the voice behind one of cinema's most beloved songs, a young star who carried an entire generation's imagination over the rainbow. But behind the magic of the movies she made as a teenager, Judy was living a very different reality, one shaped by control, pressure, and abuse from the very men who claimed to be protecting her career. Judy signed with a major studio while still a child, and by her mid-teens, she was already one of its most valuable assets. That value came with a price. The studio's most powerful executive treated Judy less like a young performer and more like property to be managed, molded, and controlled. He praised her talent in public, calling her singing something that came straight from the heart. But behind closed doors, that same praise was often accompanied by inappropriate physical contact that a teenage girl had no real power to refuse. Judy was just 16 during some of these encounters. Like countless young performers in the studio system, she had no one to turn to. Speaking up meant risking her career, her family's income, and the only life she had ever known. So for years, she endured it in silence, all while the pressures of stardom piled on in other devastating ways, including a strict regimen of pills designed to control her weight and energy, pushed on her by the very studio meant to look out for her well-being. As Judy grew older, she found the courage to confront the man who had hurt her. It didn't go the way she hoped. rather than accountability, her honesty was met with anger. Not long after, the studio quietly cut ties with her, citing vague reasons about reliability. But those close to the situation understood the real story. Judy had stopped being the compliant child star they wanted, and she paid the price for finally speaking her truth. What followed was a career that never fully recovered its early momentum, despite Judy's undeniable talent. She continued performing, continued captivating audiences, but the studio system that once built her stardom had already decided her fate the moment she refused to stay silent. Judy Garland's story is a haunting reminder of just how young some of these victims were, and how deeply Hollywood's power imbalance could reach, deciding not just a career, but a childhood. Actor 3 Tippi Hedren. Tippi Hedren. In the early 1960s, she was a relatively unknown model when one of the most celebrated directors in film history handed her the opportunity of a lifetime. What began as mentorship, however, would soon reveal itself as something far darker, a masterclass in how far unchecked power could go when a powerful man refused to accept rejection. Tippi was discovered almost by accident, spotted in a television commercial by a director known for his meticulous, controlling style and his fascination with cool, elegant blondes. He signed her to an exclusive personal contract, something almost unheard of at the time, giving him near-total authority over her career, her image, and, as it turned out, far too much access to her personal life. At first, it seemed like the ultimate break. He cast her in a major thriller that would go on to become one of the most iconic films of the decade, launching her into stardom almost overnight. But behind the scenes, the relationship between director and star grew increasingly uncomfortable. What was framed publicly as artistic devotion became, according to Tippi's own later accounts, a pattern of obsessive control and unwanted advances. She has described enduring inappropriate behavior in private settings, in his office, in cars, in moments where she had no ability to simply walk away without risking everything she had worked for. The more she resisted, the more intense his behavior became, until she finally made her boundaries unmistakably clear. He did not take rejection well. According to Tippi, he looked her directly in the eye and made her a chilling promise that he would ruin her career. It wasn't an empty threat. After she fulfilled her obligations on his next film, an atmospheric drama released in the mid-1960s, the director refused to let her go. Bound by an exclusive, multi-year contract, Tippi found herself trapped in professional purgatory. He wouldn't cast her in anything else, and he wouldn't release her to work with any other studio or director either. For years, one of the most talked-about new stars in Hollywood was effectively erased from the industry, not because her talent had faded, but because she had refused to give a powerful man what he wanted. Tippi later revealed the full extent of what happened, describing years where she was paid simply to do nothing, trapped under contract with no roles, no opportunities, and no way out. By the time the contract finally expired, the momentum she had built was gone. The industry had moved on, and so had the audiences who once couldn't stop talking about her. It would take decades before Tippi spoke publicly and in detail about what she endured, finally naming the retaliation for what it truly was, a calculated, personal punishment disguised as a business decision. Her courage in coming forward, long after her career had already paid the price, helped shine a light on a story Hollywood had kept hidden for years. Tippi Hedren's experience remains one of the most striking examples of how even extraordinary talent and instant stardom couldn't protect a woman from a powerful man's retaliation, and how the cost of saying no could last not just months, but years. Actor 4 Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth. She was Hollywood's undisputed love goddess, the face on a million posters, the star every studio wished it owned. But behind the glamorous image Columbia Pictures spent years building, Rita was fighting a private battle against the very man who controlled her career, a studio boss notorious for treating his contract stars as personal property. Rita's path to stardom began earlier than most. She was still a teenager when her career started, and her first husband, a man later described by those who knew Rita as little more than an opportunist looking to profit off her, arranged a meeting meant to fast-track her big break. That meeting was with the head of Columbia Pictures, a studio chief infamous throughout the industry for expecting far more than professional loyalty from the women under contract. On a private yacht, away from cameras and witnesses, he made his expectations clear. Rita refused. It was a line she would not cross, no matter what it might cost her. He never forgot it. What followed was years of quiet, calculated retaliation disguised as ordinary studio business. Rita became Columbia's biggest asset, generating enormous profits for the studio, and yet she found herself constantly undermined by the very executive who should have been championing her success. He fined her for insubordination. He inserted himself into her personal choices, controlling everything from her image to her relationships, all under the guise of protecting his investment. In truth, it was punishment, a way of reminding Rita exactly who held the power, even as she filled movie theaters around the world. The pressure never let up. Rita later reflected on the strange cruelty of her fame, observing that men fell in love with the glamorous character she played on screen, only to be disappointed by the real woman underneath, a woman who wouldn't be controlled, wouldn't be owned, and wouldn't simply play along. That gap between the fantasy Hollywood sold and the reality she lived became one of the defining tensions of her career. Eventually, the toll of constant conflict with the studio contributed to Rita stepping back from the industry that had made her famous. She had reached heights very few actresses of her era ever achieved, and yet even that level of stardom couldn't fully protect her from a boss determined to punish her for refusing him. Superstardom, it turned out, offered no real immunity. Only a bigger spotlight under which the retaliation played out. Rita Hayworth's story reveals an uncomfortable truth about the studio era. The more valuable a woman became to Hollywood, the more powerful men felt entitled to control every part of her life, and the more devastating the consequences when she dared to say no. Actor 5 Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple. She was America's sweetheart, the most famous child star the world had ever seen, adored in households everywhere for her curls, her charm, and a talent far beyond her years. But even the most beloved young star in Hollywood history wasn't safe from the industry's darkest impulses, a truth Shirley herself revealed decades later in her own words. In 1940, Shirley was just 12 years old when she was called into what was presented as a routine business meeting with a powerful studio producer. What should have been an ordinary discussion about her career instead turned into an experience no child should ever face. Shirley later described the encounter in her own memoir, recounting behavior from the producer that was deeply inappropriate and disturbing for a girl her age to witness. Startled and confused, Shirley reacted the only way a frightened 12-year-old could, with nervous, uncomfortable laughter. It was not the reaction the producer wanted. Offended, he abruptly threw her out of his office. According to Shirley's own account, this behavior was something of an open secret around the studio, spoken about in hushed tones among those who worked there. For a powerful man in his position, there were rarely consequences. For a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong, the fallout was very different. Not long after the incident, Shirley's contract with the studio was not renewed. As she moved from childhood into adolescence, Shirley found the transition into more mature roles increasingly difficult, and within a few years, she had largely stepped away from the film industry that had once built its entire brand around her image. Of course, plenty of child stars struggle with that same transition, and other factors certainly played a role in Shirley's shifting career. But the timing, and her own later reflections on the experience, make one thing clear. Her refusal to simply go along with what she witnessed as a child marked a quiet turning point, one that came at a moment when she was far too young to understand or protect herself. Shirley Temple went on to live a remarkable life beyond Hollywood, eventually becoming a respected diplomat and public servant. But her early experience remains a sobering reminder that Hollywood's culture of abuse didn't only threaten grown women chasing stardom. It reached even the most protected, most beloved child in America. Proof that in the golden age of film, no one was truly safe from the shadows behind the cameras. Actor 6 Joan Collins. Joan Collins. Decades before she became a household name playing the fierce and glamorous Alexis on television, Joan was a young actress navigating 1950s Hollywood, and she would become one of the few stars of her era brave enough to openly admit that she lost one of the biggest roles of her career for refusing to give in to a studio executive. In the early stages of her career, Joan found herself as the frontrunner for a lead role in what would become one of the most talked about films of the decade, a sweeping historical epic that promised to make its star an international icon. The studio's chief executive called Joan into his office to discuss the part, and what was supposed to be a professional conversation about her future quickly revealed its true nature. He told her plainly that securing the role required nothing more than being nice to him, a phrase that, as Joan would later explain, was a thinly veiled demand for something far more than friendliness. Joan was overwhelmed. She has recalled bursting into tears in his office, unable to bring herself to comply with what he was really asking. Rather than staying to negotiate or plead her case, she ran out of the room entirely, walking away from the conversation and, ultimately, from the role itself. The consequences were immediate and unmistakable. The part Joan had been the clear favorite for went to another actress instead. It wasn't a loss based on talent or screen test performance. It was, by Joan's own account, a direct punishment for refusing to play along with a system that expected young actresses to trade personal boundaries for career opportunities. What makes Joan's story particularly striking is that she wasn't navigating this world blindly. She has spoken about how Marilyn Monroe herself had warned her early on to be cautious of the predatory behavior that ran rampant throughout the industry, a warning from one star to another, passed quietly between women who understood exactly what they were up against, in an era when there was little else they could do to protect one another. Losing that role stung deeply, and Joan has been candid about how much it cost her at a pivotal moment in her career. But rather than let the experience silence her, Joan carried the memory forward, eventually becoming one of the more outspoken voices willing to discuss publicly what so many actresses of her generation endured behind closed doors, and rarely dared to name. Joan Collins' story stands out not just because of what she lost, but because of what she was willing to say about it. In an industry built on silence and self-preservation, her honesty helped pull back the curtain on a system that punished women simply for refusing to be nice. Actor 7 Kim Novak. Kim Novak. She was one of the last true studio-manufactured stars, carefully shaped in the 1950s by Columbia Pictures to become the next great screen sensation. But behind the polished image the studio worked so hard to create, Kim was quietly resisting a level of control that went far beyond typical career management. Control enforced by the same studio boss who had once tormented Rita Hayworth. From the very beginning, Columbia's chief executive treated Kim less like a person and more like a product to be engineered. He changed her name, altered her hair, monitored her weight, and expected total, unquestioning obedience in every aspect of her life. For most young actresses in that position, resistance felt impossible. Kim, however, quietly pushed back where she could, insisting on preserving small pieces of her own identity even as the studio tried to mold her into someone else entirely. More significantly, Kim managed to do something remarkably rare for a woman under that particular executive's control. She avoided his infamous casting couch altogether. Multiple accounts have described his approach to power as one of the most aggressive in the industry, and yet Kim found a way to navigate around it without submitting to his advances. He did not take that kind of independence lightly. When Kim later began a relationship with a prominent singer and performer, the studio boss reacted with outrage on multiple fronts, seeing it as both a personal insult and a threat to her marketability in a deeply segregated Hollywood. Rather than accept the situation, he escalated his response dramatically. Kim was placed under surveillance by private investigators. Intimidating pressure, some of it linked to organized crime contacts, was reportedly used to try to force an end to the relationship entirely. For Kim, refusing to submit to the studio's control came at a steep personal cost. She lived for a time under constant scrutiny, her private life treated as something the studio had every right to police and manipulate. And yet, remarkably, her career didn't collapse the way so many others had. She went on to star in one of the most acclaimed films of the era, cementing her place in cinema history despite the relentless pressure surrounding her. Eventually, The accumulated stress of fighting a system determined to control every part of her life led Kim to step away from Hollywood, walking away from the industry while she was still very much at the height of her career. It was a decision made on her own terms, in an industry that rarely allowed women that choice. Kim Novak's story stands apart as one of the few examples of a woman who resisted a powerful predator and still managed to build a lasting career. Proof that survival was possible, even if it meant living for years under the shadow of a man determined to make her pay for saying no. Actor 8 Ginger Rogers. Ginger Rogers. By the 1940s, she was already one of the most celebrated performers in Hollywood, an Academy Award-winning actress, a dazzling dance partner whose on-screen chemistry had defined an entire era of American cinema. Ginger had achieved a level of success most actresses could only dream of. And yet, as she would later reveal, even that kind of stardom didn't shield her from the predatory culture running through the highest levels of the studio system. Ginger's encounter came during what should have been a straightforward professional meeting at Columbia Pictures, a studio she occasionally worked with despite being primarily associated with a different major production house. She was called into the office of Columbia's notoriously aggressive studio chief, the same executive who had already left a trail of intimidated and harassed actresses in his wake. What began as a routine conversation quickly turned alarming. According to Ginger's own account, later detailed in her memoir, the executive began chasing her around his desk, making unwanted advances toward a woman who was, at the time, already married. Ginger was appalled. Rather than freeze or comply, she responded with firm, unmistakable resistance. She has recalled telling him plainly that she had no interest in continuing the conversation, refusing to entertain his behavior for even a moment longer than necessary. Sensing the situation was escalating, Ginger made the decision to leave his office entirely before things could go any further, walking out before the encounter could become something far worse. Her refusal did not go unanswered. The executive, unaccustomed to rejection and infuriated by her firm response, made his displeasure known in the way so many powerful men of that era did, through professional consequences. Following the incident, Ginger significantly limited the work she was willing to take at that particular studio, effectively removing herself from an environment where she no longer felt safe. It was, in many ways, a form of self-imposed exile, a quiet but deliberate choice to protect herself even if it meant closing off certain opportunities. Fortunately for Ginger, her existing stardom and her strong relationships at other studios meant she was able to continue finding significant roles elsewhere, unlike many actresses who found themselves with nowhere else to turn after crossing a powerful executive. Still, the encounter remained a difficult and lingering memory, one she carried privately for years. In public, Ginger was notably cautious whenever the subject came close to the surface, likely wary of professional reprisals or public scrutiny in an industry that rarely sympathized with women who spoke out. It would take many years before she finally confirmed the full story publicly, describing in detail how she had been cornered and harassed in his office, and how narrowly she had managed to escape a situation that could have gone much further. Ginger's experience reflected something many actresses of the Golden Age understood all too well, that resisting a powerful man's advances often meant being quietly branded as difficult, risking future work simply for setting a boundary. While Ginger had enough clout and industry goodwill to weather the storm and continue her celebrated career, her story illustrates the calculated risk every actress faced in these moments, deciding, often in an instant, whether protecting herself was worth what it might cost her professionally. Ginger Rogers' willingness to eventually share her story added an important, sobering layer to her legacy, proof that even an Oscar-winning career and enormous public adoration couldn't fully protect a woman from having to navigate, and ultimately outmaneuver, the darkest corners of the industry that made her famous. Actor 9 Maureen O'Hara. Maureen O'Hara. With her fiery red hair and equally fierce spirit, Maureen became one of the defining leading ladies of Hollywood's golden age, starring in beloved classics that audiences still cherish today. But behind her radiant on-screen presence was a woman who spent much of her early career fighting off the same predatory culture that quietly shaped so many careers around her, and who spoke about it with a bluntness few of her contemporaries dared to match. As early as 1945, when Maureen was just 25 years old, she had already reached a breaking point. The constant pressure of fending off unwanted advances from producers and directors had become, in her own words, nearly unbearable. She has described being ready to walk away from Hollywood entirely, exhausted by daily encounters where her professional worth seemed inseparable from her willingness to tolerate inappropriate behavior from powerful men. Maureen made her boundaries unmistakably clear, refusing to allow producers and directors the physical familiarity they seemed to feel entitled to. That refusal did not go over well. Angered by a woman who wouldn't simply smile and comply, several of these men responded by launching a quiet, vicious campaign against her reputation. Rather than accept accountability, they began spreading rumors questioning her femininity and desirability, hoping to paint her refusal as some kind of personal defect rather than a reasonable response to harassment. Maureen later recalled being described cruelly as cold and unfeeling, stripped of any sense of allure simply because she wouldn't allow herself to be groped or handled. It was a calculated form of retaliation, one designed to punish her professionally by damaging the very image the industry claimed to value most in its leading ladies. Despite the whisper campaigns and the reputational damage, Maureen never backed down from her position, and decades later, she remained just as resolute about the choice she had made. Actor 10 Rita Moreno. Rita Moreno. She arrived in Hollywood as a teenager in the early 1950s, full of talent and ambition, only to quickly discover just how unforgiving the industry could be toward a young woman trying to break in, especially one navigating an industry with even less room for actresses of color. At just 19 years old, Rita found herself having to fend off the advances of a powerful production executive at 20th Century Fox, the same man whose reputation for pressuring young actresses would later resurface in connection with another rising star. For someone in Rita's position, young, largely unknown, and without the protection that established stardom might have offered, resisting a studio executive of that stature was an extraordinarily risky move. Rita resisted anyway. It was a brave decision for any actress in that era, but especially for a young Latina performer navigating an industry that offered her far fewer opportunities and far less leverage than her white counterparts. The consequences of her refusal became apparent almost immediately. Rather than nurturing her potential, the studio relegated her to minor, often stereotypical roles, frequently casting her in reductive parts that leaned heavily on ethnic caricature rather than showcasing her genuine range as a performer. Not long after, her contract was allowed to quietly expire, just as she was beginning to gain real notice in the industry. Looking back, Rita has been candid about connecting the dots between her refusal and the professional stagnation that followed. She has spoken about how common this pattern was throughout Hollywood, powerful men expecting young actresses to comply, and those who didn't finding their careers mysteriously stalled, their opportunities quietly drying up without any official explanation. For much of the following decade, Rita struggled against typecasting and limited opportunities, her considerable talent overshadowed by an industry unwilling to see past narrow, prejudiced expectations. It would take years before she finally found the role that would change everything, a part in a groundbreaking musical that allowed her to showcase her full range as a performer. But by the time that opportunity came, she had already left the traditional studio system behind entirely, forging her own path outside the structures that had once tried to limit her. Rita has spoken openly in later interviews about how routine this kind of exploitation was during her early years in the industry, and how devastating the consequences could be for women who refused to comply, particularly those who, like her, had even fewer resources to fall back on if a studio turned against them. Rita eventually became one of the first Latina performers to win an Academy Award, a landmark achievement that stands as a testament to her extraordinary talent and resilience. But her path there was longer, harder, and far more obstructed than it ever needed to be, a direct result of refusing to give a powerful man what he demanded, at the very start of her career. Rita Moreno's story adds a crucial dimension to this history, revealing how Hollywood's culture of retaliation didn't strike every actress equally, and how women with the least institutional protection often paid the steepest price for standing their ground. Actor number 11 Linda Darnell. Linda Darnell. In the 1940s, she was one of the brightest rising stars at 20th Century Fox, her striking beauty and undeniable talent making her one of the studio's most promising young actresses. But that promise came under direct threat the moment she made the decision to refuse the studio chief's persistent physical advances, a decision that would quietly unravel everything she had built. Linda's beauty drew the attention of Fox's powerful studio boss, a man notorious throughout the industry for his aggressive pursuit of the actresses under his contract. As Linda grew older and more established, his pursuit of her only intensified. But Linda wanted no part of it. She made her refusal clear, rejecting his advances again and again despite the mounting pressure that came from turning down one of the most powerful men in the entire industry. He did not respond well to being denied. Rather than accept her decision, he began quietly working against her career, using his influence to stand in the way of opportunities she had every right to expect. Studio records from the period have confirmed what insiders long suspected, that Linda was passed over for significant roles specifically because she refused to give in to his demands. Almost overnight, the promising parts that once seemed guaranteed began slipping away, replaced by mediocre films she reportedly despised. By 1943, Linda's once thriving career had entered a steep decline. She was placed on suspension by the studio, an internal punishment that functioned as a quiet form of blacklisting, cutting off her income and opportunities without any public explanation. The final breaking point came when Linda secretly married a cameraman, choosing her personal happiness over the executive who had spent years trying to control her. Furious that she had prioritized her own life over his desires, he lost whatever remaining interest he had in promoting her career and effectively abandoned her professionally. What followed was a slow, painful decline. Starring roles gave way to smaller supporting parts, until eventually the studio dropped her altogether while she was still in her 20s, a period that should have marked the height of her career rather than its end. Publicly, the studio cited vague reasons like her age or her weight, familiar excuses used to mask the real story. But those close to the situation knew the truth. Linda had defied a powerful man, and she was paying for it in the only currency Hollywood understood, her career. Linda Darnell's story is especially heartbreaking not simply because her fame faded, but because that decline was deliberately engineered as retaliation